entrance to the jobs markets will increase by about 50% in most Arab countries. The unemployment problem, already very acute, will become intolerable. And this is demonstrably rendering some states difficult to govern. Hence the familiar phenomenon in many Muslim countries of the bunker regime. And in some places it's unclear whether these bunker regimes can survive. In most cases they are surviving, despite, as in places like Algeria, where the present regime was defeated roundly in the elections earlier in this decade, but nonetheless has held on. They can hold on thanks to technology. Before the modern world, mass revolts, peasant revolts if you like, stood a good chance of success because the disparity in technological equipment between the rebellion and the soldiers of the king was not so great. Nowadays that disparity is gigantic, and such mass rebellions in the modern world simply have a record of failing. Military regimes now can survive indefinitely in the face of massive popular discontent. You can control a country in quite a stable, reliable way. Even if everybody hates your guts, you can continue to do that. And this is really one of the first, perhaps it's the first generation in history where that has really been possible. Techniques of surveillance becoming more sophisticated, techniques of interrogation, torture becoming far more effective than they ever were. And they're proving very successful against a wide range of underground movements in so many corners of the Islamic world. Now this really leads to the second of the three issues confronting us in the next few decades that I suggested I would talk about. And this second issue is the issue of religious change and the challenge posed by modernity, globalization, and demographic alienation and confusion to traditional readings of Islam. Societies governed in this way by the various bunker regimes are becoming what might be called pressure cooker societies. And the consequences for the human soul of being exposed to this kind of pressure are quite alarming. The kind of religious life forms that can exist and flourish under those conditions are often very aberrant, strange ones. And already in the Islamic world we are seeing no shortage of signs of extreme, aberrant, strange behavior that earlier generations of believers would have found quite unthinkable. This is of course not without precedent. There have been extremist movements in Islam before, but they have always been roundly defeated, rejected by the caliphs, driven out to the Badlands of southwestern Iran and various other places where they were able to survive for a few centuries. This is the movement known as Kharijism, a movement that existed in early Islam and was really effectively extinguished after the end of the Umayyad period, apart from a few fairly neutralized pockets here and there. But such movements have regrettably again become a central feature of the religious political landscape of the Muslim world, and they're not going away. They're not doing our reputation any good, they're not doing the unity of our communities any good, and they seem to be poised to expand for some years to come, because the demographic and psychic, as it were, conditions for their flourishing are not going to go away. Mainstream Islamic movements, Muslim Brotherhood and so forth, are seen as having simply failed in their objective of achieving power, and desperate young people are turning to more radical alternatives. Kharijism is ironic, and modern Kharijism is ironic in that although it demands a return to unity, it is in practice a disunifying force and itself split into countless different factions. But it has one defining feature, which is the phenomenon known as takfir, declaring other Muslims to be outside the pale of Islam and hence worthy of death. And this tendency was always rejected angrily by the ulama of high classical Islam. Imam al-Ghazali wrote the classic definition of who is and who isn't a Muslim in his book Faisal at-Tafriqa. And he explains that there really is no more difficult and complex and demanding task than declaring formally anybody to be actually outside Islam. As long as they say La ilaha illallah, Muhammadur Rasulullah, the borders in traditional Islam are drawn very wide and very generously. And today, Sunni school children in traditional Arab countries still memorize texts such as the Jawharat al-Tawheed of Imam al-Laqani, who says, إِذْ جَائِزٌ غُفْرَانُ غَيْرِ الْكُفْرِ فَلَا نُكَفِّرْ مُؤْمِنًا بِالْوِزْرِ. Since forgiving what is not unbelief is possible, as we do not declare an unbeliever any believer on account of a sin. وَمَنْ يَمُتْ وَلَمْ يَتُبْ مِنْ ذَنْبِهِ فَأَمْرُهُ مُفَوَّضٌ لِرَبِّهِ. Whoever dies and has not repented of his sin, his matter is turned over to his Lord. In other words, refer it to a higher court. Don't try and pass judgment yourself. And the legitimation of differences of understanding in fiqh was rooted in differing understandings of ijtihad. And differences in spiritualities were understood and accommodated in a particularly generous way by the people of Tasawwuf, in terms of the idea of at-turuq ila Allah bi'adadi anfas al-khalaiq. The roads to Allah are as numerous as the breaths drawn by creatures. As one of the great Sufi poets put it, عباراتنا شتى وحسنك واحد وكل إلى ذاك الجمال يشير. This is from the Al-Mabahith al-Asliya of Ibn al-Banna. Our expressions differ. The way we describe Allah is different, but your beauty is one, and all are pointing towards that same beauty. Diversity really has always been a characteristic of Islamic cultures and one of the great strengths of Islamic civilization, in contrast to many medieval Christian cultures that were always striving to suppress religious diversity. However, there is a growing tendency visible amongst many young Muslims today in the West and elsewhere in favor of effectively totalitarian forms of Islam. The young activist cries, "Everyone who disagrees with me is a sinner, is a kafir, and is going to hell." This mentality clearly is a recrudescence of an essentially Khariji idea of takfir. But to understand why it's growing in the modern ummah and why it's doing so much harm to our efforts to establish Islam here in the West, we really have to understand not just the formal history but also the, as it were, psycho-history of our situation. Because religious movements are the expression of not just doctrines and scriptures, but also, and sometimes preeminently, of the various insecurities and the hopes and fears of individual humans and human collectivities. The text is the same, whoever reads it, but the eyes with which the text is read are necessarily different, and the interpretation of the religion will differ accordingly. In times of confidence, Muslim theologies tend to be broad, irenic, inclusive, generous. But when the community of the mu'minun feels itself under threat, exclusivism is the frequent result, like the hedgehog that curls up into a ball and becomes prickly, difficult to approach. And really never has the Ummah felt more fundamentally threatened than it has today. Even in the times of the Crusades and the Mongol invasions, other various calamities that have befallen the Islamic world in its long history, people never felt quite as terrified and as disoriented as we do today. In America and in the Muslim ghettos of Europe, the takfir phenomenon is gaining ground steadily. There are factions in the inner cities who are quite confident that they're the only ones going to Jannah and that 99%